Welcome to the Youth Expedition Kit Talk. Tonight in front of me you'll see a wide range of kit that we've picked out because it's going to be relevant to what you may need on an expedition. Expeditions potentially cover quite a broad remit. So we're going to try and cover as much of that as we can, but if you've got specific questions, feel free to pop them in and we'll get to those as we come through. My goal is to try and cover the fundamental stuff, the really important parts that are going to make the biggest difference in your kit selection, but we can look at some of the smaller, more nuanced pieces as well. Our focus predominantly is going to be on trips where you're going to be based in the UK, you're going to be self-sufficient and you're carrying everything you're going to need on your back. We're making a little bit of an assumption that you're probably doing this with an organised trip, so things like tents and stoves are likely to be provided for you. But if people are looking for the extra insight into those categories, then I'm more than happy to cover that too. I'm here talking on this topic mainly through having worked in the industry for 19 years now. That's with a combination of Cotswold Outdoors and with Snow and Rock here in Exeter. I've taken part and worked my way through bronze, silver and gold Duke of Edinburgh, as well as completing the Chief Scouts Challenge as well. I volunteer and help with a variety of DV groups and actually help instruct the instructors. So from that perspective, I feel quite well placed to be able to help you guys work through your kit list. I'm going to get started with what I think is the most important part, and that is our footwear. On most kit lists that you'll see for an expedition, you will see boots. And we're going to specify boots as opposed to walking shoes. I'll cover those in a minute, but predominantly we're looking at boots. And the primary reason that we're going to focus on boots is the ankle support. So if you are heading out and you're covering rugged mountainous terrain, that need to support your ankles, particularly when we're carrying a heavy weight on your back, is really important. There might be some people who are thinking, oh, that's okay, I've done loads of hill walking, I don't need that support. And that, to be fair, is an increasingly common trend. So you may find yourself heading out on a private expedition and you're packing light, you're moving fast, and you are thinking about one of the lighter footwear options. That's okay, but it's based on the presumption that you've got that ability to read the terrain and the ability and the strength to cover that ground without picking up heavy levels of fatigue or leaving yourself vulnerable to injury. So that's why we think about a boot. There's a few key elements that we want to think about. Waterproofness, certainly for the UK, is going to be one of the fundamentals. And one of the most common methods of keeping your feet dry is by utilising a Gore-Tex liner. There are a few alternatives on the market, but Gore-Tex is somewhat synonymous with that ability to keep you dry through those more challenging conditions. We are thinking about something that's fairly sturdy. So we're thinking about something that's got that stiffness to it. If I can fold it straight over or wring it out because it's really soft and bendy, that's lacking that support we need for that more arduous terrain when we're carrying all of this kit with us. Most boots will have a sole unit that's intended to work in those softer, muddier conditions as well, so we want to look for those lugs. This potentially is the most important piece of kit you're going to have with you because every step you're doing is going to be through your footwear. And it's one where we really want to focus on getting the fit precise. We get lots of people say, oh, I should go up a size, or I've been, these kind of wives' tales almost about how boots should be fitted. We'd really encourage you to come into a store, have your feet accurately measured, and we can work out what's a good match for you. We get lots of people who say, oh, I read online, my friend recommends, I read a review, whatever it may be. The focus needs to be on what fits your feet. By fit, our focus is nice and secure on the heel. We don't want to see any movement on the heel of your foot because that's going to increase the likelihood of blisters. We want to have something that feels relatively open and spacious around the toes. Any sense of restriction or being cramped at the front, that's going to, again, increase the likelihood of your blisters, but it's also going to leave you more vulnerable to what we call toe bang. That's where your toes are banging into the front of the boot. At worst, it's uncomfortable. You know, it's potentially a scenario in which it can stop that reinforced rubber rand, giving you increased abrasion resistance. We've got a more traditional leather upper, tends to, again, be a little bit more durable. We can consider the fabric boots. Same level of waterproofness because we've got the same Gore-Tex liner inside. Often this is associated with a little bit more comfort straight out of the box. With the fabric boots, you'll often see a little bit more stitching. That creates a slightly more complex shape so we can follow those contours of the foot. Potential disadvantage though is that additional stitching some people perceive that to be more points of weakness. So from a reliability perspective, the traditional leather construction is still favoured. But if you want to save a little bit of weight, fabric is one way of doing that. But again, we're going to focus on what fits you most accurately. One style of footwear we might look at is what's often referred to as mids. The idea of a mid is it looks very much like the boots that we were just talking about, but it's a little bit lower and it's a lot more flexible. So in essence, what we have is a tall trainer. We can still stand in a deep puddle and stay dry, but what we've sacrificed is that support on the ankle and that support as we cover that more arduous ground. The advantage is that it's lighter, more agile on your feet. So if you're packing really light, if you're really fit and used to spending a lot of time in the mountains, or you're just covering a much more laid back, easier trip, then absolutely mids are worth thinking about. But if it's that big expedition that you're heading on for the first time, you're carrying everything on your back, the traditional support from a boot is where we are going to recommend. In order for your boots to work, we need to think about your socks. And there's a theme that will come up throughout all the kit that we talk about tonight, and that is the materials that we're utilising and how they manage moisture. So our boots will do a really good job of stopping water coming in, apart from the hole in the top. That sadly isn't one that we can fix. But we need to think about your perspiration. So a good pair of walking socks have got two jobs. The first is to draw moisture away from you. That's often referred to as wicking. The idea being that as we draw that perspiration away from you, that keeps your skin nice and dry and means that you are far less vulnerable to blisters. It's more comfortable as well. We would expect in a good walking sock to have some strategic padding, the idea being that those primary points of contact, which are often underneath your foot, possibly around the ankle, we can have that little bit more padding to give you more comfort, often a little bit thinner on the top to let the heat out. We want the sock to come up high enough so that it's coming out the top of the boot so you're not getting chafing there. The big key, whichever socks you go for, is avoid cotton. We want to have something that is drawing that moisture away from you and wicking. A cotton sock feels comfortable initially, but it doesn't take long for it to be saturated and all that moisture is held next to your skin. So we want, in all the clothing we're going to talk about today, having that active wicking of moisture. In store, our focus will be on making sure we're getting a boot that is an accurate fit for your foot, but also is appropriate in terms of the terrain that you plan to cover. The more arduous the terrain, the more likely we are to think about that stiffer sole unit and that little bit more ankle support. The other thing that we can offer in store is guidance on how to look after your boots. Potentially, this is one of the more expensive things on your kit list. So we sell a variety of options for keeping them clean, and that will help maintain that breathability. And then we also have the ability to put coatings on the outside of your boot. Two potential scenarios there. One is to help with that water repellency so that the outside of the boot doesn't become sodden. We can do that in a variety of ways with sprays, options that we can massage in. We even have the ability to do an in-house spray on your boots with our inbox technology. From a footwear perspective, you may say, oh, well, I've got my brother's boots or my sister's boots, whatever it may be. We're happy to consider them. So if you're wondering whether or not something's fit for purpose or whether or not it's an accurate fit, feel free to bring it along and one of our experts will be more than happy to confirm whether or not it's appropriate, but also it will allow you to compare to alternatives in store as well. So whilst footwear is an option that is really important to get right, there are occasions when people come in with something that is perfectly viable already. We're more than happy to give that guidance. I'm going to move through to clothing next because we're going to carry on with those same principles. Behind me, I have a stash of all sorts of bits and pieces. Some of it is in my kind of size, so I'll be showing a few bits in terms of how it fits. Some of it is stuff for the ladies as well, and I can show you how the fit differentiates. So you'll have to excuse me whilst I rummage around. I'm going to start with what we will often refer to as the base layer. You'll see all sorts of phrases used for this. Base layer, thermals, wicking top. They're all fundamentally talking about the same job, And that is that the layer next to our skin is drawing moisture away from you and is helping regulate temperature. So if I was packing for a trip, I would tend to have a relatively thin, lightweight, short sleeve top, so that on a hot day, potentially that might be all I'm wearing on my upper half. Hot sunny day, potentially that's all I'm wearing, and I've got my other kit in my bag for if the weather deteriorates. Primary job here is wicking that moisture away from you. We might think about something where we've got the seams removed from the shoulders so that it's not rubbing on your rucksack. So whereas my shirt here has got a seam running on the top, good base layer will move that seam out of the way so it's not rubbing. That's what I would wear on a hot day. On a more overcast, cool, grotty, or possibly even cold day, I would also have with me a warmer option. So this is likely to be long sleeve. Potentially, I've got a zip neck, so that's sitting a little bit higher, so I can snuggle into it if it's that little bit breezy. But if I am overheating because I'm coming up a steep climb and I'm working hard, I can open it up and ventilate. So that just gives you that little bit more adaptability. We've got two types of base layer. The one that I first showed you is a synthetic. The great thing with synthetics is they dry really fast, they're hard wearing, and they tend to be really affordable. The other option that I've got is merino wool. This is a really great option when you're on a longer trip. Merino has a fantastic natural ability to resist odors. I can wear it day after day and it won't be offending me or any of my compatriots on my trip. That definitely has its value when you're in a situation where you don't have access to laundry. The other nice thing with merino is it's really effective at regulating temperature. So if you imagine that merino sheep, he's out in the summer and it's potentially 25 degrees, but he's also out in the winter and it's potentially down to minus 25 degrees. So merino is really good at regulating temperature. Doesn't dry quite so fast, but does tend to be comfortable if it is damp. So certainly for those longer trips, those times when you're going to be away for a long period of time, merino is definitely one to look at. That's base layers. Now I've got a box here which has got all the stuff I'm going to show you. Now I'm going to disappear and put this stuff in my done part. Next up, mid layers. So mid layers can be in a number of different formats. At the most simple, it can be a fleece. Modern synthetic fleece is lightweight, quick drying, relatively compact. Absolutely no problem with fleece. You'll see little thin micro fleeces, you'll see relatively thick chunky ones. That's potentially something a lot of people would already have. And to be fair, that's a good point. With the base layers we spoke about, you might find that you've already got some wicking sports tops you use in the gym, for sport. A modern football shirt, for example, is a synthetic wicking base layer. Absolutely no problem with you utilising stuff of that nature. Again, if you've got any doubts, please do come into one of our stores. Our experts are always more than happy to talk you through and check that things are appropriate. So fleece is one option for a mid layer. We've also got in the mix synthetic layers. So this is what we call a synthetic fill jacket. The advantage of this over a fleece is that it's naturally windproof. We also have the ability to crunch up even smaller and have a better warmth to weight ratio when compared to fleece. For UK conditions that are often associated with being quite damp, synthetics are a really good way to go. Increasingly, we'll see a lot of people with jackets like this. This is a ladies' one, so that means we're a little bit flared on the hip, a little bit tucked in at the waist, slightly narrower in the shoulder, slightly shorter in the sleeve. Down, of all the insulative layers that we do, has the best warmth to weight ratio. It's a little bit more fragile and we have to be a little bit more careful in terms of keeping it dry. The example that I have here is hydrophobically treated, so it copes surprisingly well in damp conditions. If you're reading some more traditional kit lists, they'll be really concerned about down in damp conditions. Most modern down will be given that water repellency, so it's much more able to withstand being caught out in a short downpour. Doesn't make it waterproof by any means, but it does mean that that down doesn't all stick together if you do get caught out in a downpour. If you are someone who really struggles with the cold, that potentially is the most effective way of going. What we want to watch out for though is having those down jackets that have those really thick chunky baffles. Great for sitting around camp of an evening, but potentially too warm, too insulative for us when we're moving in the hills. A really good tip would be that if you are starting out walking for the day, whether that's you've got out of the car, you've climbed out of your tent and packed up, if you're starting those first 5–10 minutes and you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm really roasty toasty, lovely and warm, that's a worry. The reason being that as you get to that first incline, that first steep hill that you're slogging up, you're going to be absolutely dripping with sweat. And for the rest of the trip, you're dealing with that extra moisture. I'd encourage you to think about starting a little bit cooler, knowing that you'll warm up as you get moving. So those are our mid layers. That's what we're wearing on top of the base layer in those cooler conditions. If it's really horrible, we're going to move on to our waterproofs. So there is a scenario where I've got my base layer, my mid layer, and my waterproof jacket on. Now, my apologies if this interferes with the mic. I am going to show how this should fit in a second. So my apologies if I sound like I've climbed inside. A couple of key things. We want to lift the pockets up high because we're going to have that waist belt on your rucksack. If your pockets are set low, that's really nice for standing at the bus stop, but when we're in the mountains, we want to lift those pockets up out of the way so you can still access them when you're wearing that rucksack waist belt. So that's a good sign when you're looking to choose your jacket that it's aimed at those more mountain orientated activities. We're going to be relatively short. We don't want it coming a long way down our legs because that's just going to impede our movement. And then also it's carrying additional fabric that's not doing anything. Our waterproof trousers will be keeping our legs dry. We're going to be resilient to those longer jackets because they're just going to be limiting your movement and heavier to carry. We need to make sure this jacket is big enough to go over the top of the other layers that we've tried. You may, in some kit lists or when you're looking at reviews or other sources of information, see the phrase winter waterproof jacket. That's not necessarily any more able to keep you dry, but the assumption is when we're buying a winter waterproof jacket that it's going to be a little bit more generous in its cut to allow us to get those greater thermal layers underneath. And it's often going to be a slightly heavier weight material. The idea being that a jacket that we're going to use predominantly in the summer is going to hopefully spend most of its time in your rucksack. And thus, it doesn't need to be really abrasion resistant. That winter jacket, where we're more likely to see the more adverse conditions, a little bit burlier fabric, more abrasion resistance, because it's going to be more exposed to that heavier use. This is where I'm probably going to go off mic, so if I'm a bit rustly, my apologies. I'll explain why I'm doing what I'm doing first though. So, you are potentially out all day, irrespective of what the weather's doing. You need to be hunkered in. So a good jacket is going to zip up nice and high, and the hood's really going to seal you in. So I've got a relatively small field of vision here, but what I've got is that sense of protection. So I'm able to carry on through regardless of the weather. If I've got my whole face exposed, I'm really going to find it difficult to stay dry. So when you're trying on jackets in store, zip it all the way up, bring that hood in. If you're completely exposed, that's probably not going to lend itself to those more challenging expeditions and more remote and arduous conditions. The jacket will be a little bit longer at the back. The idea being that that's going to stop it riding up when you've got your rucksack on. And as we talked about, it's not going to be too long at the front because that's going to impede your leg movement. With jackets, there is quite a broad spectrum of price. When you are starting out and you are buying a full kit list, potentially all in one go, or certainly relatively closely together, that can be quite intimidating. Waterproofs is one of those areas where you'll definitely see the advantages of investing a little bit more. Most of that is going to come from that sense of durability. Like with the boots, Gore-Tex is a brand of fabric that's utilized by a variety of manufacturers that is synonymous with high levels of waterproofness and high levels of reliability. But there are lots of other fabrics out there that are really capable, particularly in terms of their waterproofness and their breathability. If you're on a tighter budget, we completely understand that. So if you're thinking, I'm not sure if I'm really going to get into this, starting with a slightly lower specification jacket is okay, as long as we've lifted those pockets up, we've got a hood that's sealing you in. If you're like, I know I'm going to do multiple expeditions, I know I do lots of different outdoor sports, investing a little bit more will give you a lot more durability. We've talked about 3 layers there. We've got that base layer wicking moisture away from you. We've got the insulative layer, or the mid layer, which is all about providing that additional warmth when the conditions are cooler. And then we've got our shell layer, or our outer layer, that's keeping the wind and the rain off. There is a scenario where we're mixing those combinations up. So for example, it might be relatively warm but still raining, in which case I've got my base layer and my waterproof. It might be relatively cold but dry. So I've got my base layer and my thermal layer, or my mid layer on, and I don't need my shell. So the idea of that system of those 3 layers is we can adapt to those changing conditions. And weather changes really fast in the mountains. So you might find yourself working through the day, taking layers on and off. And that's fine, because we do need to adapt to those changing needs. What we want to avoid is that really big, burly jacket. It's really warm, it's waterproof, but we lose that flexibility to adapt to those changing conditions. So those 3 layers give us that maximum adaptability. The other factor, and to an extent this is a presumption on my behalf, the kit that we're looking at here, we're having to carry. So on the whole, we are trying to find things that are relatively lightweight. As we work our way through this kit list, the weight is going to build quite quickly. So where possible, try and find things that are relatively light. There's a balance to be had though. We don't want to have it so lightweight, it's no longer durable enough to survive the conditions that we're taking out in. And that is really for everyone to kind of find their balance where they're happy. We have some customers who are really obsessed with saving every gram, and they're more than happy to sacrifice some durability to be lighter and more agile on their feet. We have other customers who take a more traditional approach of that slightly more reliable, burly garment. They accept that they're carrying a little bit more weight, but they know that their kit's going to last that much longer. So that's the 3 layers there. Same principles to an extent for our legs. So for most people, we're going to have a pair of trousers, relatively lightweight fabric. In this case, I've got something that zips off, so I can actually remove the lower part of the leg. So if I started out on as a fairly cool day, I've got that option to unzip the leg. A little bit hard to do when you're not wearing them. But the idea is that the weather's now improved. I can turn those from a pair of trousers to a pair of shorts. And again, that gives me that ability to adapt to the changing conditions. We want to ensure that we've got something that's light, dries quickly, because if we get caught out before we get a chance to put our waterproofs on, we don't want these to be sodden and heavy. So things like denim and sweatpants, they're really best to be avoided because they're going to hold on to so much moisture and feel so heavy as a result of it. Ideally, we've got something that's nice and smooth around the waist so that we've not got any abrasion from our rucksack. And we've got the opportunity to have our pockets tucked out the way. There's no big fasteners. If there are at this point any questions with regard to any of the layers we've spoken about so far, feel free to let me know, and I'll try my best to cover those. With the trousers, we don't need to have loads of pockets and loads of accessories because they're just going to be flapping around and getting in the way. Modern trousers tend to be relatively clean in that sense. If you're on a tight budget, one of the options that you may already have is more of like a tracksuit style trouser. So rather than the cotton sweatpant that gets quite heavy and waterlogged, that more kind of thin shell-like tracksuit dries really fast, wind resistant, that's absolutely fine. And you'll see increasingly a lot of ladies just going for a legging that they might have worn in the gym. Great freedom of movement, dries fast. So again, that's a viable option to you as well, and something you may already have. So that lightweight pair of trousers, quick drying, possibly convertible to give you that little bit more adaptability is a really useful way to go. If you're heading out and it's a little bit more autumnal or possibly even wintry, it's cooler, it's windier, we do have what we often refer to as soft shell trousers. Now these sit as a halfway house between the lightweight walking trousers we've just looked at and the more shell-like trousers that we'll come on to in a second. So if it's a bit grotty and grim, these are more wind resistant, they're more water resistant, not fully waterproof, but water resistant. So I can go further into that bad weather before I need to put my shell trousers over the top. And that brings us to waterproof trousers. Exactly the same kind of materials and concepts we saw with our jackets. The only thing I would say is if you're on a tight budget, I wouldn't do a 50-50 split between my jacket and my trousers. Very rarely do people say, oh, my legs are really sweaty. It's your upper half where that's going to make the bigger difference. So if you're having to choose between a higher specification jacket and compromising a little bit on the trousers, most of our experts in store would probably agree with that principle. The idea being that you can upgrade in the future, but your biggest comfort is going to come from a higher specification jacket. When we're looking at the trousers, they will appear fairly generous. The idea being that these are going to go over the top. If you're out walking, you've got your boots on, you've got your trousers on, and then all of a sudden the heavens open, it's pouring with rain, we want to be able to slip these on over the top. So you'll normally find that the leg will open up at least to the knee, and in this case, nice and high. So I can easily get that on whilst I'm still wearing my boots. The waist is going to come up quite high to give an overlap with our jacket. So when you look at these on the peg, quite generous. The idea here is that we're getting that little bit of greater height to overlap with your jacket, and we've got that slightly looser cut so it can go on over the top of the other garments that you're wearing. With our leg wear, we want it to come down so that the water runs down your leg and comes over the top of the boots. Some people will find if they have exceptionally long legs, they're doing a lot of climbing where their legs are being lifted up and it's pulling on their trousers, or they're standing in really boggy ground, you might find a pair of gators really useful. This sits as an overlap between our trousers and our boots. So they sit here. You'll see lots of people out on boggy areas, or out on the moors with gators on so that they can stand in that really deep puddle and still not get an ingress into the top of the boots. The strap goes underneath, and then these open up to wrap around your legs. We want to have our waterproof trousers on over the top, so the rain runs down our waterproof trousers, hits the exposed part of the fabric here, and then the boot. If we do it the other way round, the water's going to run down our trousers and then go inside our gators. So waterproof trousers are over the top ideally. With all of the clothing we've spoken about, breathability is a really important element. There is no point in having garments that are really good at keeping the rain out if you're so hot and sweaty inside, you're getting really wet anyway. That really is the biggest difference between those pieces that sit at the more budget end of the market and those in the higher price points. The level of breathability as well as the waterproofness does roll through as the prices increase. If you've got a nice garment, do remember to clean it and reproof it. That's really important because the way in which those waterproof layers work is by water, or I'll rephrase that, by water in a liquid form, so rain, the particle or the molecule is so big that it can't pass through the pores in the garment. Sweat that's evaporated from your body is much smaller and that can pass through the jacket. That's the idea of breathing. So that keeps the rain out and the sweat escaping. But if your jacket is full of dirt and pollutants, even just the oils from your perspiration, that can clog the jacket and limit its breathability. So we do have the opportunity to clean it and to reproof it. We want to avoid our domestic detergents because they tend to be very aggressive. So the kind of detergents that are specifically designed for your waterproof clothing is really important to think about, being much gentler and kinder. And then we can reapply those water repellent coatings to the outside. I can see we've had a question come through. How many of the layers do I need? 2 days away, and how many socks would you suggest? Okay, that's really cool. So I would go for 2 layers for my base layers. I'm going to have a pair that short sleeve shirt, and I'm going to have that longer sleeve option. That's going to give me the ability to adapt. I might be putting on something I wore yesterday. And okay, particularly if you've gone for a synthetic, it might not feel as fresh, but it'll certainly have dried overnight. And we don't need to have fresh shirts, certainly for every day, particularly if we've gone for merino. Socks-wise, if you've got the ability to carry a fresh pair of socks, they do feel lovely. I can't deny it. If I can, I'd always try and take a fresh pair of socks for each day. Eventually we run out. I can't carry socks indefinitely, but no problem to launder them whilst you're away. Even just a rinse in a stream will freshen them up and dry them. You can take with you, somewhere on here I think I've got some all-purpose soap. That can help as well, just freshen them up. What you'll often do is do a rotation. So for example, on the Saturday I'm wearing a fresh set. On the Sunday I take my second set. And for the Monday I'm wearing again my first pair that I've had a chance to give a rinse and a thorough dry, so they're good to go again. Underwear is the only thing we haven't touched on. So I'm going to try and join that together. Again, fresh set of undies is always welcomed, but inevitably there is a finite number that I can carry. We might want to think about our choices there though. There are 2 approaches. The same principles apply as to the other layers. We want to make sure that we've got a layer that's managing moisture. The vast majority of underpants that you'll go and buy on the high street are cotton. And that's quite comfortable initially, but it is going to hold that moisture. So if you're working hard, you're perspiring, see if we can go for something that's actively wicking that moisture away. For the guys, certainly we might want to think about some additional support and help reduce chafing. Ladies, we can go in 2 directions. Some go relatively minimalist in an attempt to stop chafing. Others go for a little bit more of a boy short for the exact same reason. Hope that covers that one. As I say, if anyone's got any other questions, do let me know. Where were we? We were talking about that we'd covered our clothing, and we were now going to look at some of our other clothing items that we might have with us. So we need to be prepared for all conditions. You might start out on an expedition and the weather's glorious. And as such, we've got our wide-brimmed sun hat, not necessarily the most stylish of looks, but that full brim gives us that ability to cast shade. When you've been out for 8 hours a day, you'll really appreciate that extra shade and not having such a red-hot tan. But in my rucksack, I'm still carrying an insulative hat. I've still got gloves. Particularly if you're doing an organised expedition, so things like Duke of Edinburgh, for example, you may look at that kit list and go, well, hang on a second, the forecast's really good. Why am I taking these things? There's 2 elements at play. One is because the weather does change really fast in the mountains, so we do need to have that ability to adapt. But also, if you're in that organised group, there's a degree of onus on the leaders to ensure that you're prepared. So for a lot of those trips, they'll be keen to see that you have that kit so that they're covered and protected too. And in reality, it's really good practice to be in that position where you can adapt to those changing conditions. Particularly if you're caught out, you'll be really grateful that in the bottom of your rucksack, you've got those warm layers available to you. Another question's come through. Tumble drying Gore-Tex to reactivate waterproofness. Yes, the idea here is that the heat from the tumble dryer helps align the polymers that are on the outside of the garment so they adhere better to the fabrics. If you look on the inside of your jacket on the care label, brands are really keen for you to clean and reproof your jacket because they know it makes a big difference to its performance. The vast majority of jackets on the market will be quite happy in the tumble dryer. I wouldn't stick it on the highest setting, and I'd tend to pull it in for relatively short bursts. The other thing to consider is that we're not necessarily needing to dry it fully. So if you're back from an expedition and you are Cleaning your kit ready for the next trip, I'm going to stick it in the wash and use that detergent to keep it nice and clean and allow it to breathe at its best. I'm going to apply that water repellency to the outside of it. I can let it drip dry for a little bit. I don't have to fully dry it in the tumble dry. It's only to expose it to the heat to get those molecules to adhere and align. Increasingly, a lot of products though, you'll even see them referred to as air dry. So maybe the simple answer is to say, check the care label on an individual garment. We've spoken about the idea that we're going to be prepared for a broad spectrum of weather. So I'm going to have some thin gloves. I'm going to have a warm hat that ideally covers my ears. I'm going to have a sun hat that's giving me a good amount of shade, because that way I've got that ability to carry on going irrespective of what the weather's doing. Another one that you might see on the clothing front are buffs, brand name, all sorts of phrases used for them, but buff by far is the kind of most ubiquitous. These are really versatile. You can wear it as a scarf, you can wear it as a hat, we can wear it as a bandana, super versatile, a degree of wind insulation, wind protection I should say. Big fan of these, can be used in so many different ways. So even on a hot day, that's quite nice to wear as a headband if you're really perspiring a lot. So super useful piece of kit. Doesn't weigh much, really adaptive. So that's definitely one of my little favorites. On one hand, it does feel like I've whizzed through clothing. Around me is an entire store full of a myriad of products. And in reality, we can adapt and look at the kind of nuances in store. My focus tonight is just a couple of those key things we want to think about in terms of helping you select something with an expedition in mind. So I'm just going to do a quick recap there. Avoid cotton. Go for layers next to your skin that are actively wicking and drawing moisture away from you. With our mid layers, same principles, no cotton. Think about something that's lightweight to carry. So for example, a big thick cotton hoodie, it's going to be really heavy when it's wet. It's not actually that warm in comparison to the garments that we've looked at. And then our shell jacket, we want to have those pockets lifted up so that we're clear of our waist. We want to have that hood that really envelops and seals you in so you're protected when Mother Nature is throwing her worst at you. Again, if you've got questions, I'm more than happy to answer them wherever I possibly can. And that's the same in store. Our staff in store are very accustomed to customers coming in and wanting to understand the pros and cons of different things. So they're more than happy to talk to you about, can you revive an existing garment? Is something that you've borrowed from your older brother appropriate? Is there, you read online this great deal, this great brand, and you want to know whether or not it's too good to be true? I'm more than happy to talk to you about those challenges. So we've talked about boots, we've talked about clothing. I'm going to start to move on to equipment, unless there's any other questions coming through on clothing. Well, I think there might be one. How do I stop my spare clothes getting wet from the rain? Okay, no, that's fair. I've got that as part of my rucksack, but we can talk about that now if you'd like. So, the materials that the rucksack is made from are fundamentally waterproof, but where it's been stitched together, you will get moisture soaking through. A lot of rucksacks will have incorporated into them a rain cover. So that goes over the rucksack. The idea being that now we're limiting how much moisture can get through. The limitation of that waterproof cover, my apologies, I suspect that's been super rustly on the mic, is that the harness is still exposed and we're not absolutely sealed in from the elements. So a rain cover can help, but we want to watch out for the fact that they rustle in the wind and they can snag on things as you go past. Personally, I tend to prefer dry bags. Dry bags come in two kind of styles, I guess. You have what are often referred to as rucksack liners, great big sack, lightweight, waterproof material, and that comes with a roll closure. So we can fill that up with all of our kit. We can roll it over a few times, and that's then sealed. And that acts as a liner inside our rucksack. I'm not such a big fan of the big ones myself. I much prefer to have several smaller ones. My logic is that if I've got everything in one big sack, when I need something halfway through the day, I'm having to rummage around to find it. I try to be a little bit more organized and I have a couple of smaller ones. exactly the same materials, exactly the same principles. I try and color code this to be a little bit more organized. So at home I have a red one that's got all my dirty, stinky, wet stuff that I really don't want to wear. I've got my clean, dry stuff in my green one. The other thing to think about is we don't necessarily need to have everything in dry bags. So my stove, my tent, for example, they don't need to be protected. It's only really going to be our clothing and our sleeping bag that we really want to concentrate on staying dry. So that's dry bags. We'll touch on those a little bit more when we come back to rucksacks. I'm going to cover a few pieces that are here on the table. So we've spoken about the reason we were buying our boots is to give us that support and reduction in fatigue whilst we are covering that arduous ground. We've got a myriad of kit here that's going to be on our back. One of the things we can do to help ease the strain is to have a set of walking poles. If you struggle with the weight of your rucksack, if perhaps you have traditional challenges with things like your knees or ankles or stability, we can set you up with a set of poles that will take a lot of the strain off. I can see there's a question coming through. How hard wearing are some of the clothing items? What can I do if I damage my jacket or trousers? Okay, no, that's fair. With regards to the outer layers, so our waterproof jackets, you will often see ripstop fabrics. That's where they have a little grid integrated into them so that if you snag them on, say, a barbed wire fence, it doesn't tear all the way through. You've only maybe got a small nick. If you've got particularly an outer layer that you have been really unfortunate on and nicked it on, something like a barbed wire fence, for example, then there are a number of repair services that you can utilize. Come into the store and we can quote you for a professional, long-lasting repair. We do repair kits as well. In terms of longevity, base layers go a really long way. Merino tends to struggle a little bit with bobbling, particularly on your shoulders of your rucksack, but many, many years for base layers. You know, if you speak to a lot of outdoor experts, they'll have drawers and drawers full of base layers. Mid layers, similar vibe, particularly fleeces. Other than maybe an ember from a bonfire burning a little hole through it, fleeces, again, really great life expectancy. Waterproofs tend to go a long way in terms of their actual integrity. The big one is that caring. We'll see people who come in with a well cared for jacket that's 10 years plus and still going strong, but at the same time we'll see customers who've forgotten and never cleaned their jacket and they're struggling after 18 months. The big one for waterproofs is clean and reproof it. That will make the biggest difference. In terms of the abrasion resistance, there are fabrics that are better to that. So you'll see references to what's called the denier, which is in essence how tightly woven the fabric is. That tends to give it an increased abrasion resistant. Some waterproof jackets, for example, will have reinforcements on the shoulders, the hips, those high areas of abrasion. Hopefully that helps. So coming back to the poles, the reason that poles can be really important is because they're distributing the load. If we're just carrying the rucksack and we've got 2 points of contact with the ground, we can double that by having 4 points of contact. The idea being with the walking poles is they pack up relatively small and then we can extend them out when we need them. I've had a few knee surgeries over the years. I don't really use my poles for climbing, but when I'm coming down a steep terrain, I'll get them out of my bag and I'll set them up as such. The adjustability allows us to have just slightly greater than 90 degrees in the arm. The strap is there so that the pole is in position without me needing to grip it. Normally adjustable, so we can draw that in, so it's sitting in the situ. And the idea is that as I'm going along, I'm using this to help with my stability and take some of that load off my knees. If you're going on an expedition and you thought, yep, I'm gonna get myself a pair of poles, do a few practice walks. We do see occasionally people who are struggling to coordinate all 4 of their limbs at the same time. So a little bit of practice springs through. Best advice I can give is to an extent, pretend you've not got a pole with you. So as you're naturally walking, your arm's going to swing and we're going to then drive off from that pole. And that can help with your efficiency. So if you're covering really long distances, we want to help reduce the fatigue. Poles is a really worthwhile investment. So, I'm probably going to think about, we've I've done those, so that's fine. I'm just going to have a little shuffle around whilst I work out what we're going to cover next. Have I made sense so far? Am I on the right lines? So we've spoken about how we're going to keep you warm and dry during the day when you're out walking. I'm going to move on to some of the stuff we want to think about how you're going to stay warm when it's bedtime. So I'm not going to do tents unless there's a specific question that comes up. The logic being for most youth trips, the group that you're going with, whether it's a school, a World Challenge expedition, a scout troop, the vast majority of them will be distributing tents. They know it's an expensive piece of kit and it's normally shared between participants, so it'd be unfair to expect people to bring their own. If you are in the market for a tent, again, we've got loads of reviews online, we've got loads of tutorials, loads of information to help you make a selection, and again, Staff in Store will be more than happy to talk you through that. But tonight, I'm going to focus on sleeping bags and roll mats. So, at the moment, this looks a little bit cumbersome. There is some logic to that. If you store your sleeping bag crushed up really tight and small all of its life, when you go to get it out and use it, it's going to be flat and limp. We want it to be lovely and light and fluffy because that's going to be where the insulation comes from. So if you can, try and store it loosely. A lot of the sleeping bags that we sell will come with a storage sack like this. Inside we have the smaller bag that we can pack it down into when we need to carry it, but I'm just going to flip this over the front here so you guys can see. What hopefully you can see there is we have what's often referred to as a mummy shape. The idea is it's tapered down at the bottom where our feet are and broader up at the shoulders and then has a hood at the top. The idea behind that is that a rectangular sleeping bag has got more space. That's going to take you longer for your body heat to warm that space up. And you're also then carrying around a load of additional fabric that you've got to carry. It's unnecessary weight. So the idea of a mummy, a tapered sleeping bag, is it's more efficient. It's going to have a better warmth to weight ratio and you'll warm up quicker inside it. The one that we have here is synthetic. So just like we saw with those mid layers and insulative layers, the advantage of synthetic is it copes really well in damp conditions, really great price points, and is really hard wearing. Down sleeping bags, as a sweeping statement, tend to be a little bit lighter for the same amount of warmth, but they need that little bit more care, and they do tend to be priced at a little bit higher. So for most youth groups, certainly, synthetic sleeping bag is where we would expect you to be. You'll see people talking about season ratings. There is a bit of vagueness within this. A few years ago, there was an international standard that was set to try and give you some comparability. So you might hear phrases like extreme comfort, comfort limit. In simple terms, what they're trying to do is describe the scenario in which the sleeping bag is appropriate to use. A 3-season sleeping bag normally has a lower comfort limit of around -6 degrees. If you know it is going to be -6 degrees, most people will avoid taking a sleeping bag where that is rated at -6. The idea being that's the point where I'm starting to get cold and uncomfortable. If you're absolutely trying to stretch the performance and travel as light as you can, you might choose to push those boundaries a little bit. But for a typical UK trip where maybe I'm sleeping at night and it's, let's say, 2 degrees on the ground, a 3-season sleeping bag rated at -6 should be giving me a comfortable night's sleep. One of the things to factor in when you're trying to gauge how much warmth you need from your sleeping bag, when you're looking at the forecast, the temperature quoted is 1 metre above the ground. The idea behind that is that that's more useful generally, but when you're sleeping on the floor, it's potentially that little bit colder. Does it matter? Oh, sorry, we've got a question coming through. My beautiful crew behind the camera here, I've got this fantastic board that they're showing me with all these questions, so if I look slightly surprised when I see them holding one up. Does it matter if you have a sleeping bag liner or not? 2 advantages of sleeping bag liners. The advantage is that I can easily launder the liner. So if you're using your sleeping bag loads, super easy to take the liner out, pop it in the washing machine, dry super quick, real easy. Most people will struggle to launder a sleeping bag themselves at home. Your washing machine just isn't big enough. The other advantage of a liner is it is a way of adding some additional warmth. Everyone will quote you kind of their anecdote about how much liners give. You'll see cotton liners. For casual family camping where you're not having to carry it, we're not worried about the performance, they have their place. You'll see synthetic ones, they work really nicely. My favorite tends to be the silk liners, beautifully light, really comfortable next to the skin, and really good at regulating temperature. We do thermal liners. So you might find that normally you're going out and a 3-season sleeping bag is absolutely great, and then you decide you want to do your first winter trip. You know it's going to be sub-zero. There are thermal liners that we can add that can add a season to your sleeping bag. So yeah, worth considering, but not essential, particularly with a synthetic sleeping bag where potentially that's not too difficult to launder. You might struggle to wash it in your standard washing machine at home, but the laundrette will have a nice big one, not a problem to do it yourself. Down sleeping bags, if you need to launder them, it's possible. Again, you need a nice big washing machine, probably a commercial one rather than a domestic one. The challenge isn't necessarily the cleaning it, it's the drying it. Down products, when they do get wet, take a very long time to dry. We do a laundry service, so it's possible for you to drop them in with us. We can send them off and get them cleaned for you. Particularly with down sleeping bags, that's well worth considering every now and again. A couple of things to think about with sleeping bags. We've talked about the shape and its efficiency. You'll see female specific ones, so they tend to be a little bit shorter, a little bit narrower. They also change the distribution of the insulation. That standardized test that we spoke about earlier involves placing, in essence, a set of sensors in a sleeping bag, and they measure at various points how quickly it cools down. Some manufacturers might be strategic in how they place their insulation to help improve their statistics there. But what you'll often see on the female ones is that there's a little bit more insulation around the feet, because on a whole, women tend to draw their heat into their core a little bit more, and their extremities will feel that cold that little bit sooner. You can get extra long, so if you're particularly tall, you can get hold of extra long ones. You'll see left and right zips. For most people, if you sleep on your back, you are going to reach over. So if you are right-handed, you'd normally have the zip on the left. If you're like me and you fidget a lot in the night, probably doesn't make much odds whether you have a left or a right. Occasionally, possibly not for the youth groups, but if you're maybe a couple heading out on expedition, you might think about a left and a right, and it is possible to combine those and join them together to make a double. When you have a mummy-shaped sleeping bag, they won't quite join together all the way, but certainly you've got the opportunity to do so if you need to. One classic challenge we see with people heading out on their first expedition when they haven't had to pack one of these away before. It's either come in the big sack that we saw earlier, or it arrived very neatly packed in the little storage pouch. And you'll see all sorts of people wrestling with their sleeping bags, trying to get them packed up. My suggestion would be, go with the name of the bag. It's a stuff sack. Grab the end where your feet go in the sleeping bag, grab a big handful and stuff it in. You can try and roll it, and that's possibly how it came from the factory. Trying to do that yourself is pretty challenging. The other advantage of the stuffing principle is that it's a little bit more random. When you roll your sleeping bag, time in, time over and over, you can find that that impacts on the distribution of the insulation. You end up with this rather wavy distribution. The advantage of stuffing is it's nice and random each time. Just draw in the cord, that's gone in nice and easily. And then what I've got is some additional straps that I can fold over. Kindly, this one's been left nice and tight for me. But the idea is that we would open this up, bring those straps around, and we can draw this in to crush it down even more. And we're going to use those straps to get that nice and compact for when it's going in your rucksack. But when you're storing at home, avoid storing in a little pouch. You utilize the bigger sack if your sleeping bag came with one. If you haven't got one, pillowcases occasionally for some of the thinner sleeping bags, but just give it the opportunity to loft and stay nice and open and spacious. We've got another question come through. Any tips on how to stay safe on a multi-day trip? Okay, we can touch on that. There's a couple of things. The real kind of classic tips would be, make sure people know where you're going. If no one knows that you're missing, the odds of help coming are pretty minimal. So as an absolute minimum, if you're going away on a multi-day trip, let people know what your itinerary is. Approximately where are you going to be on a given day? And let them know when you're due back. Have something in place so that if you are late, you don't arrive, then people know who to reach out to and where approximately you're going to be. In the modern age, there are a number of devices that you can utilize. We have the safety blanket in our daily lives of a mobile phone, and for most people, that's really useful in an emergency situation. We need to consider that in a mountainous situation, potentially you may not get a signal. So I wouldn't rely purely on your mobile phone. If you're heading out regularly into really remote locations, particularly if you're traveling solo, there are a number of devices on the market that can be set off in an emergency. So the idea is that they have a metal coil that's rolled up inside, and when you activate them, it springs out this big antenna that helps you get a mobile phone signal, and that can send out a pre-recorded message confirming your location and that you're in need of help. So hopefully that covers that one. I can see my colleague feverishly scribbling away here, so I suspect there's another question coming through. It's a big question. I can see him scribbling away. What would you recommend to prevent insect bites? Well, that's a can of worms. So we can do insect bites. The first one is a good tent will have a liner to it, and that liner is designed to be bug resistant. So avoid having the inner of your tent open for long periods of time, because that allows all of those critters to come into your tent. So it can feel a bit of an event at the time, but if you're, for example, in Scotland in mid-season, you will have that thick cloud of midges swarming your tent, and you may play quite a strategic task of entering your tent as quickly as possible and opening it at the least amount that you can. There are a number of products that you can apply, so various insect repellents. Most of those use DEET as the active ingredient. You'll see it in a couple of different concentrations. The higher concentrations, you need to be a little bit careful with how liberally you apply it. It's a pretty potent chemical. I would certainly keep it away from my Gore-Tex jackets. You'll do some damage. So maybe have a look at the kind of medium strength, or if you're going for the high concentration, use it really sparingly. If you need to apply it to your face, put a little bit of it into your palm, and then you can dab it on. That way you're not getting it in soft tissue areas like your eyes, your nose, your mouth. Other tips, the more traditional approach of oil of citronella works really well for Scotland. You can do that in a number of ways. You can get oil. Try and stay away from areas of standing water. So lakeside can feel really picturesque of an evening, but you'll tend to see a higher concentration of those biting insects. Hopefully that's covered that one. One other little tip from experience. On a lot of trips, it's inevitable. As much as we have a variety of measures that we take to avoid being bitten, you're bound to get a couple, particularly if you're in Scotland. You'll see various ointments that you can put on a bite to stop it feeling itchy, stop it becoming inflamed. We do, and it's annoying that I've not got one on the table, we do a little clicker. If you've ever had a gas hob where you press the little button and it sparks for you, that's referred to as a piezo. We do a little device that in essence is a little piezo spark, and it works really well at reducing the desire and inclination to need to scratch at a bite. And it's often that scratching that is then breaking the skin, creates more infection, spreads the toxin that is creating the itchiness. So if we can resist the urge to itch a bite, it heals so much faster. So we get those little clickers which stop that crave or satisfy that craved itch. That's really good, found those really effective myself in the past. As we're on that kind of topic of health, I'll cover a few bits here, and I'm conscious we need to finish sleeping in a second, but I'll cover those as well. We spoke about sun hats earlier and the importance of giving you shade when it's a hot sunny day. Suntan lotion, so easy to forget about it, particularly on a day that's windy. lots of us spend a disproportionate amount of our times working indoors. So from that perspective, we want to think about having a suntan lotion on, even if it's just on your key points of contact, top of your nose. Don't forget backs of your ears, those areas that tend to see that sun exposure. Just because we're not necessarily being used to being out all the time. So good sweat resistant suntan lotion is super useful to have. Similar kind of vibes in a way. Oh, personal safety, whistle. That's the other one that we always try and take with us. In an emergency, super useful. Go for what we call a peri whistle or a peeless whistle. You might have a really loud one at home. If you hold it up and rattle it and you can hear a little pea ball shaking inside it, we're a bit more hesitant to take those into the mountains because in cold conditions, that little pea, that little ball freezes and your whistle won't make any sound. So go for what's often referred to as a safety or a peri whistle. I tend to go for a plastic one. The metal ones are cool and shiny, but they freeze to your lips. So plastic one tends to get my vote there. Earplugs is the other one I always pack, particularly on a trip where I'm having to share my tent with someone else. Really useful. Good night's sleep makes a big difference. So we've done what's going to keep us warm when we're in our tent. That's a sleeping bag. But we're going to think about what we're going to sleep on. Two jobs of our roll mat. One is to provide insulation from the ground. That's not too difficult to achieve, whether it's a traditional foam roll mat or, as is increasingly popular, the self-inflating mattresses. The foam mats are really light to carry. They do okay in terms of insulation. Their limitation is their comfort, and obviously they do tend to be fairly bulky. This is one of the few things that we would be happy to consider on the outside of our rucksack because it's so light. Potentially you might find you've got your mum's yoga mat. Exactly the same principles. Easy one that you can cross off the kit list quite quickly if you need to. Don't get me wrong, the outdoor ones are likely to be a little bit denser. They're often closed cell foam, so they won't hold moisture if they're exposed to the rain during the day. But yeah, foam mats are a great way to go if you're on a tight budget. The reason that the insulation underneath this is important is because when we lay on our sleeping bag, we crush down the insulation underneath us. So we need to find that again with our roll mats. And particularly because the ground is cold, you're going to lose loads of heat through the ground. So the insulation underneath us plays a really big part. You can have a really warm sleeping bag, but with an ineffective roll mat, well, you will struggle. So the self-inflating mat that I mentioned often packs down much smaller. This is a brand new one, so it comes with a little bit of extra packaging. Really nice and compact. When I unroll it, it's spent its whole life crushed up, so it won't be that keen to open up. A little bit of a taper, just trying to cut the corners off, save some weight. When you first open it up, if I open that valve, it won't be that keen to self-inflate. What we can do is give it a little bit of a helping hand. Now what I tend to do is lay that out and I'll go and sort out the rest of my gear, I'll put my dinner on, and when I come back, the foam inside will have risen, and the air will have rushed in, and I can close the valve. That's a self-inflating part. As I say, when they're brand new, they tend to be a little resilient to that. If you can, when you're storing them at home, just like the sleeping bag, try and store it loose. So whether that's underneath a bed, behind the sofa, give it that elbow room so it's nice and fluffy. That also helps to let the air circulate through. So I leave the valve open so that any moisture that was in my breath when I inflated it, we're then in a position where that's not sat inside, the air can flow through. The other little tip with these is when you are finished and you need to pack them away, you'll see all sorts of people wrestling with them. And of course, as soon as you get off it, let go of it, it's going to open up. So the first thing we're going to do is fold it over a couple of times. We are going to try and squeeze some of that air out. And then what I'm going to do when I squeeze some of it out is I'm going to close that valve. What I've got there is now the ability to, I've squeezed some of the air out and now I've not got more air rushing in. What I could do is roughly roll it up, squeeze that remaining air to the end. And on this one, I've got a little extra release. So I can squeeze that, a little bit of extra air out. Now at this point, I'm going to close that valve again. Some of the simpler ones, that's really essential. Some of the newer ones like this have got a valve that's a little bit more, smarter. At this point, I've squeezed most of the air out. What I'm now going to do to get it back in that tiny little pouch, fold it over. A little bit harder with everything on the desk, but I'll do my best. Keep it lined up. And we're just squeezing that last little bit of air out. Rolling that to the end. And again, we can open this up. And that's now ready to go back into that little pouch. So, we've got our sleeping bag keeping us warm, we've got our roll mat giving us some comfort. If you tend to sleep on your side, something a little bit thicker, one of the thicker roll mats will give you that little bit more protection from the hard ground. If you are trying to save weight, you'll see some short ones, so we're just getting your shoulders and hips on them. There's a number of different choices there. Things we want to avoid though is forgetting one entirely because you'll have a really bad night's sleep, or taking the more traditional air bed that you might have used on a family camping holiday where it came out of the boot of the car, or perhaps you had as a sleepover when your aunt came over to visit. They're okay in terms of comfort. They're quite thick, so you won't feel the lumps in the ground, but because it's a big chamber of air underneath you and there's no insulative qualities to them, you'll cool down really quickly. The second one is they're really bulky and heavy. You've normally got to take a pump with you as well, so those kind of big, often blue and red, quite thick air beds, not appropriate for expedition use. So, I'm going to talk about my final really important one, and that's rucksacks. We touched on them earlier when we were thinking about how we can keep our kit dry. If you are doing an organised trip, you will have a rucksack recommendation in terms of the capacity, and that's based upon getting everything that you need inside the rucksack. And the reason that's important is when it's on the inside, it's closer to you in terms of your centre of gravity. It'll be more comfortable to carry. If it's lashed onto the outside, it's exposed to the elements, so it's more likely to get damaged, wet, possibly even lost. So we want to think about getting as much of our kit inside our rucksack as we can. For a big trip where we're going away for multiple days, we're carrying a tent, a stove, our food, we are self-sufficient, you're probably looking in most cases around 65 to 70 litres. If you're going on a really specialist expedition where you are taking extra equipment, you might go above that. But for most people, if you can't get it in 65, 70 litres, I'd really beg the question, what is it that you've packed? Occasionally we'll see people who come in and they're hoping to go a little bit lighter, a little bit smaller in terms of their rucksack. Few scenarios where that's possible. It might be that you're doing a hut to hut. So you're not actually having to carry your tent or your cooking facilities with you, in which case 50 litres is the norm there. Or you might just be really keen on shaving every gram that you can. You pack really minimalistically. With each item that you choose, you're choosing the lightest, most compact version of it. One of the things to think about is not just the capacity of the rucksack itself, but how well does it fit you. So this is where the fitting comes in. Most modern rucksacks, we can adjust the length from the hips to the shoulder. So we can slide the shoulders up and down to suit the individual. You'll see female-specific rucksacks. They tend to be a little bit narrower in the shoulder, they're flared for the bust, and they're what we call canted on the hips. So women on the whole have a slightly more pronounced hip bone, which we can utilise as a little bit of a shelf on which to sit the weight of the rucksack. The gents' rucksacks, we don't get quite as much advantage there, so we have to draw it in a little bit more securely. But I'll try and demonstrate what we're looking for with the fit of the rucksack. And again, my apologies if my mic is rustling away. On the hips, you'll notice that my shoulders here are nice and loose. Now this is quite easy with an empty rucksack, but I'll give you some tips when it's loaded up. So we start by getting the rucksack onto our hips, drawing that in. And now what I'm doing is all the weight of everything that I'm carrying is going through my legs. Your legs are used to carrying you around all the time. For want of a better phrase, it's what they're designed for. The more weight we can get through the legs, the more we're sparing your back. If we start cranking in on the shoulders, all of my load now is going through my back. I'm compressing my shoulders, I'm compressing my lungs, I'm restricting my ability to breathe, I'm restricting my ability to move, and my waist belt is just stopping my bag bouncing around. I've not actually transferred much weight down into my legs. So we're going to start with the shoulders relatively loosely. We're going to draw in on the waist, and then the shoulders a second. What we're looking for is that nice roll over the shoulder. So I've not got it gaping up, and I've not got it kind of compressing and pulling me down. If you're struggling, again, come into store and we can set up the rucksack for you, whether that's selecting a rucksack that is the best fit for you or taking the one that you have and fine-tuning it for you. The sternum strap that comes across the chest, and again, this is going to rustle beautifully on the microphone, so my apologies. This is there to stop those shoulder straps splaying off. You don't need to crank it super tight, because all we're going to do is create that sense of constriction. So we just want to have a little bit of tension on there just to stop those shoulder straps splaying. And then over the top on a good rucksack, you'll see I've got a couple of little straps I can pull in, and that's bringing that load that's behind me and bringing it closer to my center of gravity. When I'm covering really challenging ground, so some steep terrain in front of me, I might draw these in a little bit tighter to give me that confidence and improve my center of gravity. But when I'm on more level ground, I might back those off ever so slightly. That's something you can play with. You'll do some fine tuning to find that sweet spot for you. Most rucksacks will have a number of straps that allow us to bring the weight that sits here and draw it in close to you. But at the most fundamental level, pick a rucksack that fits you. Just like we did with our boots, there's no point in having a great piece of kit if it doesn't fit you. Within the rucksacks, a traditional expedition pack will have a couple of features. We'll have what's called a floating lid. So the idea is that the lid of the rucksack can come up so that when our rucksack is packed to the gunnels, that lid is staying on top and we can get that extra gear in. We will expect to have access to the rucksack through the top. In most modern rucksacks, all those pulleys are one-hand adjusters, so I can just open it up with one hand. So most of my stuff that I'm putting in the main compartment is going to be stuff that I don't need during the day. So my spare clothes, probably my food for my evening meals, my spare kit. The things that I want closer to hand are going to be things that I might want at short notice. Some of that might be snacks, some of it might be my hats and gloves, things like my waterproof jacket I want quick to hand. Things like my tent, I don't need that to the end of the day, so that can get buried deeper in my rucksack. When you're packing, think about where we're putting the densest, heaviest things. And that brings me on to hydration. We'll come back to packs, but hydration ties in really nicely with these. We're all familiar with the traditional kind of water bottles that we see people out on the hills with. The idea here is that we're taking water with us. We need to drink 2 to 3 litres a day with us. The bottles like this can be a little bit hefty, and when you're storing them, you tend to have to put them in the side pockets, a bit awkward to get to during the day. So increasingly you'll see people utilising a hydration system, pipe work, to come out and sit just in front of us. So I've now got one of the densest, heaviest things I'm carrying right close to my centre of gravity in the small of my back, and I've got my mouthpiece on the end of my hose right in front of me so I can just take those regular little sips. The advantages of that is you'll stay quite consistently hydrated throughout the day. With the traditional water bottles, when you finally disconnect, rephrase that, when you finally dislocate your shoulder and get your bottle out, you'll be really annoyed and dehydrated. So little and often is a really good way to go. With the sleeping stuff, I know I whizzed through that as well. I mean, I know we've been here for a while, but nonetheless, are there any questions that I've missed on the sleeping stuff? With the rucksacks, we've got those smaller pockets for keeping those accessories and snacks close to hand. And what you'll normally find is at the bottom, you will have another point of access, often associated with a sleeping bag compartment. Most modern packs we can open up and create one large compartment there. My focus in terms of where you're packing things would be think about when you need it. So the things that I want close to hand, I want to have in those side pockets, possibly in the lid pocket so I can just reach back and grab it. My water, for most people these days, will have in the bladder so they can drink a little and often from their hose. And then things like my waterproof jacket, I'll maybe utilize the stretchy pocket on the outside on the back of the rucksack, so that if I've maybe taken it off because the weather's improving, my jacket's wet, I can put that in that little mesh pocket on the back of the rucksack, and my waterproof jacket can be drying whilst I'm walking along. It would be really easy to dive into all the details and nuances of a rucksack, but I'm going to come back to that basic principle of buy a rucksack because it's an accurate fit for you, have it set up. When you're trying them on, try it with weight in it. They all feel really comfortable when they're empty. Potentially we've got 10 to 15 kilograms in here. So definitely try it on with some weight in it. Most good outdoor shops will have some weight bags. They can load it up and see how you're doing. Another question that's come through, are there any snacks you'd recommend to increase energy levels? A broad topic. We could easily do an hour presentation just on nutrition in the mountains. From my personal experience, I'm going to think about, and my focus is twofold. I want to think about things that are giving me a slow release of energy so I'm consistently fueled throughout the day. You'll see people have this great big hearty breakfast, and then they pack a fantastic picnic for their lunch, and they sit down and they have this great big lunch break. What they're going is these big peaks and troughs of energy. From my experience, I try to fuel a little bit more, almost drip feeding through the day. So I've got those small things that I can graze on. I can maintain a more consistent energy level through the day. That's both with my hydration, but also with my food intake as well. I learned quite quickly in the early days of expeditions that you need to think about how stuff travels. Bananas are a great source of energy, and you'll see loads of people raving about them from a nutritional perspective. But if you put a banana in an expedition rucksack, it's black and blue by the end of day one. When I take out lots of youth groups, we'll see people go, oh, I've packed chocolate. It's tasty, it's got some energy, I guess, but it's normally melted, again, fairly quickly. Little tips from my experience, jelly babies are a favorite if you want that little treat. They're really robust, very difficult to break a jelly baby. They'll cope in all conditions. And they're surprisingly effective in terms of their energy density. You'll see the gels and the more kind of sports nutrition. Gels are really good as a quick pick-me-up if you want to get energy into your system quickly. I tend to prefer things like cereal bars, muesli bars, something that gives that nice slow release, something that doesn't require loads of water. So, for example, you want to avoid lots of salty snacks. A little bit of salt now and again is fine because you're losing it through the sweating and your electrolytes. But we don't want to be eating loads of salty snacks like a packet of nuts, for example, or certainly salted nuts, because they'll be adding to your need to drink. Another question that's come through, what do I use as a pillow? Oh, this is a really, this rings home for me. I really struggle without a pillow. Don't get me wrong, like there's lots of things that I sacrifice and uncompromise with in terms of my comfort. Pillow is one that I can't sleep without. What I do is I'll take an empty pillowcase and I will then take my insulative layers that I've been wearing through the day, pop them in that empty pillowcase, really space efficient, allows me to get plenty of support, a nice comfortable pillow. You'll see inflatable pillows, from my experience, they're not that comfortable, they tend to be fairly hard, they're not particularly forgiving. You'll see little kind of foam cushions and such like, but yeah, definitely one to think about. But as I say, empty pillowcase, utilize the insulative clothing that you're not wearing whilst you sleep. So, rucksacks, we've spoken about the fit and the importance of that. We've spoken about the potential to put covers over the top or use the dry bags. When we're talking about youth groups, this is a really important factor. I'm going to give the game away a little bit here. If I am heading out and my rucksack weighs 10 kilograms, that is 10% of my body weight. We'll have participants on things like Duke of Edinburgh expeditions who weigh half what I do, but they're having to carry the same kit. Their rucksack still weighs 10 kilograms. So that needs to be really diligent with not only what they're taking and putting in their rucksacks, but how well set up their rucksack is, how supportive it is. We touched on the idea that we want to have as much of the weight transferred into our hips and our legs as we can. One of the big factors of that is the waist belt. So what you'll notice here is we've got this really nice, supportive, secure waist belt. We don't have just a little piece of webbing. We've got those supportive arms that are supporting that weight, transferring it into your hips. If your rucksack has got a really soft, squidgy waist belt that isn't even able to support its own weight as an empty bag, that's a clue that it's not going to transfer that weight through into your hips, and a lot more of the work is going to be done by your shoulders and your back. So that more substantial waist belt is really useful. Okay, we're on to the little bits and pieces that remain on our desk. We've done hydration, that's fine. Two possible disadvantages of the bladders. Some people worry about punctures. It's really rare. We do see it. It can be useful, particularly in a more remote area, to think about the more traditional bottles from a reliability perspective. You will see some bottles that have very wide necks. That's really useful if you're filling up from natural water sources or you're using a water filter. They do tend to make a bit of a mess when you try and drink from them. So as long as I know I can get to my water, I tend to prefer something with a narrower neck. Just much easier to drink from, you make far less mess. I've got a few things left on my desk that I want to talk about. We spoke about safety earlier, so we had the idea of letting people know where you're going to be, what time you're due back, that you are recording your route, that you're confident and capable in terms of navigation. We've got our whistle to signal for help if we need it. Frustratingly, I've not got one with me tonight, but we would normally pack a survival bag. That is a thick polythene giant bag, for want of a better phrase, that if it's all gone terribly wrong, you can climb inside. So let's say you're out with a couple of people, someone has broken their leg, you've not got the opportunity to set up the tent, but we need help keep them warm and dry. We can pop them into that survival bag. It's a little bit sweaty, but it's going to keep the worst of the weather off. They're normally bright orange, so really good for attracting help in an emergency. So survival bag is one that I try and take with me whenever I'm going out. I'd much rather have that safety net available to me than wish for it when it's gone wrong. First aid kit's the other one. Nearly always on a proper kit list. Doesn't need to be fully comprehensive. If you're going out on a managed expedition, leaders will tend to have a more comprehensive kit. But if you are thinking about your own needs, you'll see pre-packed ones. There are varying degrees of provision, depending upon how medically trained you are. There's no point in having a first aid kit full of all sorts of wondrous pieces if you've no idea how to utilize them. The other one is think about potentially making one with the bits that you've got at home. So that might be some plasters, some bandages, some tape, bits and pieces that you would take for granted that you would have in the first aid kit at home, and you can make those up. If you're doing a youth expedition and you're trying to stick to a really tight budget, a sandwich bag with those basic provisions in will get you out of a high percentage of situations. The little pre-packed ones are a little bit more comprehensive. They come in a nice waterproof case. They are really nicely organized. So in that emergency, you've got everything to hand. They've also got guides in them talking you through what to do for certain emergency procedures. Other bits and pieces on my list. We spoke about how we were taking care of our kit when we come back from trips. If I'm going away for a while, I'll think about an all-purpose soap. I can use that to clean and launder my clothing if I need to, but also that's pH balanced, so I can use that on myself, give myself a freshen up of the morning. With that in mind, we can also think about a travel towel. Certainly not going to take the big one from the bathroom, it's just too big and heavy. But you saw how small this packs down, really nice and light, just about big enough to give me some modesty if I'm coming out of the shower block or walking back to my tent. Looks relatively small because that's so super absorbent, that'll be more than sufficient to dry you, and I'm then not having to carry that big bulky towel we might associate with home. A few bits and pieces left. We have got our torch. I haven't taken a handheld torch into the hills for a very long time. Always we're going to recommend a head torch, the idea being that I've now got my hands free to rummage in my rucksack, to work on my stove, to look at the map for tomorrow morning, or potentially navigate at night. If I'm having to hold the torch in my hand, I've halved my ability to do most of those tasks. Head torch is definitely the way to go. Very rare these days for them not to be LED, which gives you great efficiency and battery life. Increasingly, you'll see them being rechargeable, so you can plug them in and recharge them. Obviously, that's great for those shorter trips. If you're going away for a longer period of time, a longer trip, some people like to take something where you can put the traditional AA battery in and they'll take provision for them. Or if you're going on a really long trip, you might think about a small solar panel and you can charge that up during the day, ready to use at night time. But yeah, definitely a head torch. If you're going and you think you're going to be navigating at night, look for something with that deeper penetrating beam so you can see ahead of you. If you're just going to be using it in camp around the evening, think about just that nice localized glow. We have got left on the table, I've got some food options just in case anyone was talking about that. Some people are very much into their gourmet cooking and go to great lengths to prepare beautiful meals when they're away. For those of us who are maybe feel like there's enough going on as it is, you might consider the pre-packed meals. They fall into two categories. The one in my hands at the moment is what we call a wet meal. I pop that into a pan of hot water and that heats it up, and in essence that is good to go. Really simple and easy to cook. We do the dry meals, lighter to carry, pack down a little bit smaller. This is where we're adding hot water to them. They can, when cooked and follow the instructions carefully, be perfectly tasty. But I've seen plenty of people make a hash of them. Ooh, another question's come through. My favorite piece of kit. It's a tricky one because there's so much. I think, if I'm honest, it's probably my boots, because it's the one piece of equipment that makes the biggest difference. It's the piece that every step of the way, no pun intended, is looking after me. So for me, my boots are my favorite piece of kit. If you've ever had a pair of boots that don't fit really well, you'll know how miserable that can be. When you find a pair that fits really nicely, you'll do everything you can to hang on to them. So boots for me is one of my favorite pieces of kit as a kind of category. I can't deny I'm not a fan of a bit of tech. So some of the latest GPS watches, really useful. I'm old enough to remember when it was very frowned upon to take GPS with you, and everyone was keen to ensure that you knew how to use your map and compass as your primary navigation tool. Increasingly, my map and my compass is my secondary piece of equipment. So that's what I have in my rucksack as my backup, and I'm using my GPS, whether it's a handheld one or a wrist-based GPS. That's where I'm referencing. So when I get to that fork in the paths, I'm probably referencing my GPS these days rather than getting my map and compass out. But I've got my map and compass with me still as a backup. What else have we got left on the table? I think we've covered the vast majority of it. As I mentioned at the start, I'm surrounded by kit. There are 1,000 things that we can dive into. So at this point, I'm just going to open it up to a little bit broader picture. There's inevitably something that I've forgotten. There's inevitably something that's specific to your trip. Any questions out there? Cool. So I think that's most bases covered. I'm going to recap with a couple of key principles, a couple of key things to take away. The first one is with our clothing. We're thinking about 3 layers. The layer to draw moisture away from us, our mid layer to provide us with insulation, and our outer layer to keep the wind and the rain off. And that approach of 3 layers and avoiding cotton gives us that adaptability to cope in all conditions. I'm going to think about my boots, because that's so important to my comfort. Focus on what is a really precise and accurate fit. Nice and secure on the heel, spacious on the toe, something that feels like it's really carefully contoured to follow the shape of your feet. Ideally with that little bit of stiffness and support to cope with that more arduous ground and carrying everything on your back. And then the final one was the rucksack. That's my kind of top 3. My rucksack, again, I just want to get that fitted so that it's supportive and carrying that weight evenly and comfortably throughout the trip. Beautiful. Well, I'm no doubt that there's more questions out there. If you have got them, do contact your local branch. All our staff are really keen to help and pass on their experience and knowledge from their time in the hills. Thank you for your time.